I'm a shrimpo. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's Badger History Group lecture of 2022. This is, I think, the third one this year, organized by Verlin Mueller, our director and president. Tonight's speaker is Mike Mossman, who is one of the original founders of the Badger History Group. He's also our vice president of the board, and he will be speaking about what do birds, what is it? Birds, mammals, and insects have to do with history. And then something after that about the Badger Army ammunition plant, because you changed your title, right?
I added, yeah.
And we'll hold questions till the end, but you can go ahead and type them into the chat. We have a lot more people on Zoom than we have warm bodies in our museum tonight. So we'll take your questions at the end. And if you want, we'll probably open it up so you can ask in person as well, but I'll let that be Mike's decision. So thank you very much again.
Howdy, everybody. Let me get my screen shared. There. So I've worked on Badger ordinance issues since the Army decommissioned it, or started to, when they announced it in end of '97. Originally, I was interested only in the birds and the animals on the Badger plant, and it didn't take me very long as I worked through the plant doing that to realize that the history of the place was really fascinating. It was critical to what birds I was seeing and hearing, and critical to the conservation value of the site. So all these animals I'm going to be talking about tonight really are, just as we are, kind of products of our history. And I want to talk about that, explain some of that. It's more than sort of what we think of when we think of insects in history, such as plagues and little cartoon characters and market gunning and that sort of thing. So if you are out on Badger these days during the summer, you may see people doing all sorts of things. And what are they doing anyway? I'm going to be talking about that, about all these different projects. Everyone out here is working on a conservation biology project. The history of the Badger History Group, the mission is, as you see here, to collect, preserve, and share the histories of the former Badger plant and the Sauk Prairie. We help each other learn from the past, engage with the present, and guide our shared future. And that sort of dynamic, active, sort of vibrant aspect of history that this last sentence explains is how I see my work out here. In the vision for the history group also includes to build meaningful human relationships with our cultural histories and the Badger lands. And you'll notice that this mission and the vision say histories, meaning that's it's a wide, diverse range of topics and interpretations that we have of history, and that's good. I also see history as memory. Pretty simply, it's like going to the store, voting, anything that you do, you rely on your memory to act in the present and always with a mind to the future. And that's, I think, how our historical work should be as well. I'm going to be talking about animals and landscapes kind of from a perspective of conservation biology. Conservation biology really focuses on biological diversity. It means conserving not only species, but the ecosystems that they comprise, along with their environments. It means that we're looking for sustainability in the world, in our particular communities, which ensures a balance between our own human needs, our economy, and the environment. And not just for us, but to make sure that that happens in the future as well. It also involves culture, ethics, really accepting responsibility in our relationship with the land and with the natural resources and with each other in ways that make not only our economies and our societies sustainable, but the resources in the world that we depend on. I'm also add something here on environmental history, because this is, again, what I'm talking about when I discuss the ecology and conservation of badger, where we think about our relationship with nature and with the land and how that evolves and changes. There's a history to that. And another thing that I think most of us understand also is that sort of beyond all these definitions, there's something about a kinship with nature that that we strive for and that may come regardless of whether we do or not, and something we want to advocate for others and help them with. These pictures, the central picture is at the dance when the Ho-Chunk Nation received their part of the Badger Army ammunition plant. And on the right is Mrs. Genuine, who was visiting her farmstead with her granddaughter and sampling the apples that were still from the trees from 70 years prior. And she remembered those very well. The bottom is Dave Fordham, the former commander's representative for the Badger ammunition plant in the prairie that he helped establish and that is now out there along Highway 12, north of the parking area, north of the entrance. I'm going to be talking about SGCNs often, and these are species that have a special conservation need, and they're often the ones we focus on when we're dealing with conservation biology. We're interested in maintaining healthy communities with all the species that belong in them, but oftentimes many of those species don't need help, and we try to help the ones that do need it and pay attention so that we make sure the others are coming along with it. So this includes endangered and threatened species, species that are declining, species that have really restricted ranges, especially if they used to have larger ranges. It almost always has to do with declines. That's a historical part of it. And figuring out what population trends are and what these trajectories are of populations and of the habitats these animals rely on. SGCNs are listed by the state DNR, and it's really a thorough process. I used to be on the committees that did this. People don't always agree, but we do follow a consistent methodology, and they're consistent with and contribute to the State Wildlife Action Plan, which really talks about how to guide our management actions throughout the state based on what species need and which species are in need in different parts of the state, that sort of thing. Again, there's a historical component to this always. There's always a question of what's rare now, was it always rare? Is it rare now, but it never was even here until recently? So we have to evaluate those things. Again, I mentioned we use a standard international scoring methodology that assesses the attributes of a bird's population that determine how threatened it is. And it also, in this process, you identify species that have certain status, or uncertain status rather, and for which we need more information before we can even tell if they are of conservation need. And some examples here, out of the 153 butterfly species in Wisconsin, 19 are SGCNs, et cetera. So when we try to work with biodiversity, usually you want to look at it from different perspectives, but usually you're trying to use a top-down approach. That is, you look globally, you look at a species' entire range to decide if that species is really in trouble, if it's in danger of going extinct. Then you look down closer and closer to your own landscape, your state, whatever your management area is, and see, is there something we can do about that here? It may be that it's a species that's very common or fairly common in your area, but you're one of the few areas left in the world that that has it. It's sort of the case with the Henslow sparrow that we'll talk about. It may be disappearing throughout most of its range, but you may be at the center of that range and still have lots of opportunity to manage it, even though people say, why are we spending time on this? You see it everywhere. So it's that kind of perspective. It's what we can do to help the species in its entirety. And we also, again, look at ecosystems. So we don't just look at individual species, but we care about the assemblages and the communities of plants and animals together, and not try to get too concerned with individual species, but to manage the habitat and the ecosystems in a way that's healthy for not only the SGCNs, but for everything that belongs there. Oftentimes, something that is an SGCN, it's declining, is often a signal to us that something is wacky in the ecosystem. And so we try to take that perspective as much as possible. So given that it's really important to know what species, say for the Sauk Prairie area, were here in the past, which ones have declined, which ones might be able to get back here if we work at it, if they've been lost, and to understand sort of what the potential is. We often look back for historical references, and we can look back at the landscape, first of all. And here on the left, you see Rob Nury, a local guy who reenacts the Surly Surveyor as one of the original land surveyors that came through after the land was taken from the Ho-Chunk in our area, and then started dividing it up into these grids. And as they did so, they left records at every section corner, quarter section corners, et cetera, of the vegetation and what they passed through. That's a great record of the land as it was starting to change after the Indians left and the whites were just starting to move in. I also want to honor Ken Lange here, who's done so much work at trying to figure out how the land has changed. And he went through all the survey records, for example, for the county, and plotted out the communities that were across the landscape in the 1830s and 40s, which is very useful. I'm going to kind of start with birds and work through habitat changes on the prairie and land use changes. And then I'll move into some of the other animals. There's lots of historical references. Some of them are really hard to dig out, and some of them are really hard to interpret. One here, the first real work on Wisconsin birds was by Frank Hiram King, who included economic relations of Wisconsin birds in the 1870s in his Geology of Wisconsin. Back then, it was really important there for a while to try to understand how useful birds were to us or damaging. And some of the accounts are a little odd as we look back at them, talking about birds in terms of what was in their stomach contents and therefore how much damage they're doing to our crops. But people that wrote these always loved the birds, really, because they knew them. And so there's lots of good natural history information in there. The other person I mentioned here is William Canfield, who was one of those early surveyors in the county, and wrote this in 1870, before King wrote his state book on a catalog of birds in Sauk County. And there's lots of cool information in there. In order to interpret it, you often have to go back to the textbooks that were written at the time, or that Canfield would have had at hand in terms of what he called the birds, the names that he used. But you can usually figure them out by going back to those early texts. Another piece of historical information that's really fascinating, and we're lucky to have it, Kurt Miney, who's here and knows a lot about this, is a study that went on just across the river from Badger. You can see the blue line here, where that study area was. Went for about 20 years, led by Aldo Leopold at the beginning. And they were looking at a landscape, an agricultural landscape, and the wildlife on it, and the relationship between agricultural land use and habitat and animals. There's Leopold on the left. That must be, I don't know if that's Arrington in the back, Kurt, but talking with some of the local farm people. It really was important to have a good relationship with the landowners here. And you can see the kind of detail. There's the study area is up on the right, and that aerial of a more recent view of it. It's just along Highway 60 as you cross the bridge. And you can see on the this one that's mentioned hedgerows, they have the hedgerows marked off. That was a real important component of their study. You know, back then it was pretty low impact ag compared to what we have today. And hedgerows were disappearing. Little back corners of unused land were disappearing, and they were basically documenting what happened as a result, and tried to encourage not plowing every acre, but at any rate to see what would happen. And here's a bobwhite quail coveys that that were monitored there. You can see there used to be a lot of bobwhite around here. I'm sure there's no bobwhite there unless somebody releases them anymore. Two people that did a lot of the field work. One is Albert Gastro on the left, who was a local taxidermist and nature lover, hunter, trapper, and somebody that really was passionate about not turning every fence row into you know, plowing right up to the edges, but leaving hedgerows and having some nature left on the landscape. His relatives are still in town. If you know Julie Cody, it's her grandpa. And the guy on the right is Harold Hansen, and he studied birds there, but he also studied mammals, small mammals. That's the first sort of scientific survey of small mammals in the state in a way that could be repeated on a particular piece of land. As we look more recently, some of the historical references we can use include North American Breeding Bird Survey, and this was started in the late 60s by the guy I see up on the upper left, Chan Robbins. And it's based on routes all across North America. And here you can see all the routes that are in southern Wisconsin on the left. And each route is a roadside route. And you stop at regular intervals, the same interval each year, and count all the birds that you can see or hear in 3 minutes. And on a particular route, it may not be very useful because you're only there for 3 minutes each year. But when you pile these up over hundreds and hundreds of routes every year across North America, it provides really good population trend data. And you can see here on the right, just an example with the eastern meadowlark from 1966 to 2019, the decline, which is very characteristic of all the grassland obligate birds. So you can see it in Wisconsin, more variable in Wisconsin, partly because we're a smaller sample size, and more of a smooth declining curve for the continental population. We rely on this a lot to determine bird status. It's become a very standard gauge. Another more recent source of information is the Atlas of the Breeding Birds of Wisconsin, where people take small tracts or about 3 by 3 miles basically, and work on the birds of that particular area and try to find all the birds that are breeding there and look for evidence of breeding. We did it once in the late 90s, and they just finished it again 3 years ago. They're still working on the data from that, but it's shown population trends just in that kind of 20-year period. And you can see on the right here is an example. That's why I don't have this labeled, but that's Bell's Vireo locations in the state from this Atlas project. You can see it's just sort of a Triflaceria bird, all those purple spots. And these ones right in here are badger. There, which is a great place for Bell's Vireos. There were a few inventories also done here. TNC did an inventory in '93, just to see what sort of value there was for any plants or animals if there's anything rare here or in need of management. And then there was another biological inventory done by the Society for Conservation Biology in '98, right when the plant announced that it would be closing. So we can use those sources of information. Another way that we look at trends is by extrapolating from knowing what the habitats used to be like at a certain time period and knowing what birds occur in those habitats today, and extrapolating backwards to some extent, we can do that. And so time and space are both involved here as we think about trends. I'll give some examples of that later. So at the onset of European settlement, this is kind of the general land cover of the badger, which is outlined here, and its surroundings. The yellow being the prairie, and this is the 14,000 acre sauk prairie. The stippled orange is savanna, where trees were spaced quite far apart so they could have very open canopies. And the red is oak woodland. Probably almost all of it maintained somewhat by fire, but with trees closer together. And the green being more forest on the Baraboo Hills in areas that did not burn or didn't burn very frequently. So badger, basically prairie, savanna, and perhaps some woodland, grading here from savanna to woodland. It's not a clear distinction. So this is the painting done by Victor Bachtin. It has been used as a visualization for many people to what badger might become and what it once was. It's pretty accurate. Bison probably were here not very often, but they were certainly here occasionally. The elk definitely around more. If you can see this closely, if you look at this, like all Bachtin's paintings, there's great information in the detail. And there's actually all the birds that are in here. There's a couple dozen, I believe, are carefully researched and includes things like the long-billed curlew, which is extinct from or extirpated from Wisconsin, the swallow-tailed kite as well, bobolinks, upland sandpiper down here, etc. Also, the woodland in the back, you can see on the south range of the Baraboo Hills is more open than it is today, which we know was the case. And a picture of savanna, an actual drawing from 1852, and still was fairly prevalent on the landscape. And you can see the original extent of this up in the upper left in southern Wisconsin, what an important aspect of the landscape it was, and how very, very little, less than 100% remains, 0.01%. But there's some restorations that goes on, such as here in Dane County on the right. And we can hope that badger will have the same future for part of it. Here's some of these species that would have been fairly common on that landscape prior to the big changes that happened with white settlement. Long-billed curlew, I mentioned, a bird of the deep prairie sod, which it would probe with its beak. Swallow-tailed kite, which nested in the savannas. Prairie chicken on the open prairie. And the sharp-tailed grouse, which is perhaps even more common in the shrubbier areas, or at least as the prairie started to become overtaken by shrubs with the lack of fire. And the grassland birds, such as these, were certainly common. And we know that not only from the rare accounts of early settlers, but also from people that were writing at the same time and exploring farther west in Iowa and the Dakotas and so on, especially in Iowa, where the prairie was not broken at all yet. And I'll mention what those birds are later. So with settlement, with white settlement came huge changes in the land. This is land cover from the Bordner survey, in which they looked at land uses over the whole, every acre almost of Wisconsin. And so this is a 1940 aerial shot here. And on that, we have the land boundaries of the farms that were here. And if you could see this up close, you'd notice that it's almost all, Badger's almost all agriculture, probably 95%. The colored blocks are pasture, and those pasture, basically the moraine runs like this at Badger. Whoops, excuse me, like this. And all that pasture is on the moraine. It's not in the flat outwash plain to the west, which is where this stuff out here, which is where the Ho-Chunk owns this land now, the flats that were very productive prairie soils and where the Sauk Prairie existed. But even though most of this was open land, it's not the kind of open farmland that we have today. If we look at these pictures, for example, from the Army, when they came in 1942 and bought the farms, assessed the farms, and sort of half bought them and half took them, you'll see it's a very open landscape. And there's lots of pictures like this, and pictures where you can see corn shocks, and there's a lot of grass, and there's a lot of small grain on the landscape. And even the cornfields were not cleanly ag like they are today, nor the grain fields. The grain fields today are pretty bare of any wildlife, at least during the breeding season, and bare of weeds, bare of weed seeds, and so on. But it was different then, and wildlife did flourish. A lot of things. Prairie chickens probably became more common for a while than they even were on the prairie. For a short time period when there was both grassland and some agriculture there. This is Owen Gromy's prairie chicken painting down on the right. And upland sandpipers were surely here up until the advent of the plant. This is a picture from farther west, but this would look a little bit like Badger, at least in terms of lots of grassland and grassy hay, very important grass hay. But starting in, about 1940, or especially after World War II, there were great changes in agriculture. Alfalfa replaced grass hay, row crops increased, fertilizer and pesticides, and landscapes became more fragmented, simplified, more roads, a lot of stuff, a lot of land that was not plowed turned into woods. And you had these sharp divisions between woods and fields, and everything became pretty fragmented in southern Wisconsin for sure. Predator populations changed, increases in raccoons and skunks, for example, ground predators. And I mentioned the woody succession. And then there have been efforts over the last few decades on trying to bring some of that land back into grassier agriculture and reduce erosion for various reasons. We can see from the breeding bird survey data, if you follow this yellow line, that's the trend line generally for grassland birds in the whole of North America, starting in 1970, about when they could start detecting trends, and going up till 2019. Over half the birds disappeared. It's generally the group that's suffered the most out of all habitat guilds of birds over that time period because of these agricultural changes. But it was not the case at Badger so much. Badger is unusual in that it took the land from the farmers and kept it in a very sort of a similar state, with lots of grass on the landscape, lots of pasture, while the landscape around it changed to corn, soybeans, and alfalfa, and feedlots where the cattle didn't graze on the land. And so it was a haven for grassland birds. In '98, having looked at the report from the TNC showing lots of grassland birds that were here, for example, still lots of bobwhite quail in '98, unheard of. There were probably, I don't know, dozens of quail out here, and they weren't being planted. So I did these plots. I walked transects and did point counts, sort of like they do on the federal breeding bird survey, 5-minute point counts in this case, throughout Badger. And as you can see on the right, these are on the different property boundaries of today. So it covered all the properties Even at that point, it was still all within the Army's ownership. And I did that again, and I did 98, 2012, and 2017. I was not able to do it between 98 and 2012 because of all the deconstruction going on. It was pretty much off limits to walking transects through everything. Just to show you some changes that happened and the response of birds to changes in the landscape. In 98, the buildings were still all here. There were still about 1,400 buildings. Grazing was prominent even among the buildings. There was limited woody encroachment. You could see it when you had like a little substation like this one here with a fence that kept the cattle out and the deer out, that they get full of shrubs eventually, and it told you what was going to happen when you took the cattle off. There's some limited prairie restoration along Highway 12. This is Donald Kinchy teaching some teachers about it since he was so involved with that. Lots of other infrastructure besides buildings, lots of steam pipes and utility poles. And there was some cropland. So what was the bird community like? With all that pasture, it was great for upland sandpipers, which love that. They also need large tracts of grassland. So upland sandpiper here. Field sparrows like a little bit of shrub. There was fair populations of them. Henslow sparrow, which likes grass with thick thatch, were almost absent because it was grazed and the grass was short. Red-headed woodpeckers were abundant. You know, the utility poles, nesting, and using them for foraging perches. Dick thistles were, which like tall weedy forbs, were pretty uncommon. There wasn't much place for that. Bluebirds were fairly common, again, in the old buildings and utility poles, and also with some nest boxes. Orchard orioles were not as common regionally then, but they were here. Bobolinks were common. Bell's vireos, which love shrubs, did not exist here. Grasshopper sparrows were common in the pasture, and savanna sparrows were very common in the pastures. In 2012, the deconstruction had occurred. There's lots of disturbed soil with rank weeds, the sort of things Dick thistles like. Because the grazing had stopped, the grass turned very lush when it had developed this great thatch layer, which the Henslow sparrows liked. And then there was all this woody encroachment. This is stuff like autumn olive, honeysuckle, buckthorn, a lot of stuff that the Army had planted as cover crop for wildlife in the like in the 70s, and but it would have come in anyway, and it's run rampant over the landscape in the absence of any grazing or fire. Infrastructure disappears, and there's a little bit of prairie restoration that goes on. So I mentioned Bell's vireos start to show up in those shrubs then. Savanna sparrows disappear pretty much because the pasture's gone. Bobolinks stay common because they're fairly adaptable to these different grassland types. Red-headed woodpeckers decline. Dick thistles have a heyday in all those weeds that come from that come up after the deconstruction on this disturbed soil. Henslow sparrows are abundant in some areas, just thick with them. Upland sandpipers almost disappear. Grasshopper sparrows decline, but they're still there. 2017, the last time I did this set of surveys, things were continued to change. Prescribed burning had begun by the Ho-Chunk, creating these vast grasslands like you see down here on their land. And it's also repairing from the disturbance that happened during the deconstruction. Even on these, like the deterrent burning grounds, one of the sources for groundwater contamination. After doing as much mitigation as possible, this was seeded to grasses and became part of a larger grassland. Grazing is still goes on the dairy forage land, but nowhere else. And woody encroachment continues, even though it's controlled in some areas, it still keeps marching through the woods, the savannas, and the grasslands. The grasslands are all European. There's only one real remnant of prairie on badger, very small one of just a couple acres at the hillside prairie, it's called. The rest is pretty much dominated by, at least the grasslands, by Eurasian species with a mixture of native stuff in with it, like common milkweed, for example. And at this point, upland sandpipers are, I think there may be one still left out there, one pair. Bell's vireos continue to thrive. Red-headed woodpeckers are pretty much gone without the the structure. And Henslow sparrows have declined, but still are fairly common in the dynamic that occurs in between burns. When it's burned, in the areas that were burned where it used to be abundant, they pretty much disappear for the first year. And then after that, they start to come back year by year. By the third year after a burn, they're usually fairly common again. So just look at the change in landscape. Here's this pretty much the same view of the rocket area, looking west. In 98, before the buildings were removed, in 2015, as deconstruction had ended, you can see the shrub encroachment. How much grass? Look how much grassland there was in 98. And down in the magazine area at the south end, the same sort of thing. So let's just look quick at what some of these species, how they responded during these three periods. Upland sandpiper, these are locations, these X's are the point counts. So anywhere I found an upland sandpiper, at least one during my 5-minute count, there's a circle around it. Upland sandpipers, by 2017, there still seemed to be one pair around here, even today, but I don't expect them to hang on forever. They do really like grazing. And you can see the population change on the lower left. Here's Eastern meadowlark, was just everywhere, almost everywhere in 98. And by 2017, because of shrub encroachment mostly, it's been lost from a lot of areas and still occurs out in the Ho-Chunk prairies, especially where the shrubs are, you know, if they're scattered, it's okay. It can handle it. Meadowlarks are okay with a few scattered shrubs, but you can see the change, and there's the population continuing to decline. Henslow sparrow, as I mentioned, there was, I think, one pair here in 98. 2012, there's very few circles, but in each of those circles, there was often many Henslow sparrows. They almost seem colonial in that sense. In 2017, they're more scattered, and there's not as many of them. These are places in the Ho-Chunk land out here. Those circles are in areas that weren't burned in the year of the survey. Red-headed woodpecker, the decline that I mentioned, with the loss of utility poles and buildings, and loss of pasture as well, because they forage by fly catching often off of utility poles or some kind of elevated perch, a tree. I mean, it's a savanna bird normally or originally, and foraging by fly catching in the air or going down to the ground and catching insects off the ground. When red-headed woodpeckers were more common on the landscape, they were commonly found dead on roads because they were feeding over them or on them, off the utility poles on the edges. Bell's vireo, the shrub-loving endangered species, really exploded in the last 20 years because of the invasion of exotic shrubs. So it poses a sort of an interesting dilemma in terms of, do we want to, how do we manage for this bird, or do we want to? If we could just get rid of the invasive shrubs and bring back its native habitat, which would have been shrub thickets in the prairie landscape or on the edges of prairie landscapes, with things like plum thickets and so on, that would be ideal. And here's the yellow warbler, which likes taller shrubs, thicker shrubs, and you can see its population increasing with shrub invasion. They also like saplings, you know, so they're doing fine. And just to let you know what management is still going on, there's still deconstruction mitigation going on for contamination, taking down fences, and the landfill is going to be there forever. And so that's still managed. Invasive shrub control is picking up steam, especially on the DNR land, which inherited most of it, both with cutting and with just spot treatment, as you see down on the bottom with herbicide. Prairie restoration has begun in a big way on the Ho-Chunk land. And you can see down here on the right, that's about half of the hillside prairie that you see here. It's not very big. It was never plowed, probably. It's here because it was on a southwest facing steep slope with thin soil. That's Allison Duff, who's now the ecologist with Dairy Forage Research Center, who is very important in maintaining the management on that site to keep out the shrub invasion. But the prairie restoration follows these, it's still early. We only had a third growing season last year, and it starts out the first year pretty weedy, like down here, low, gets mowed because there's a lot of weed stems coming up. The second year, it's getting bigger with a lot of annuals and biennials, and also gets mowed in areas where it's particularly weedy. And then the third year, it starts to really blossom. Actually started in the second year too in some spots. Prescribed fire is used more and more by the Ho-Chunk, and they can do big tracks, and it keeps out the shrubs. It also changes the grasslands, removes the duff. It also encourages growth, and oftentimes, when we look at Henslow sparrows, for example, that react poorly the same year to a fire, when we look at all the sites that it's common on today, they all have a history of fire management. So it's important, and it's a dynamic that changes. The habitat changes from year to year after a burn. When it's burned, it kind of gets set back, and then there's years with hot burns, years with patchy burns, and so on. It creates the diversity in the landscape that is probably natural and which we want. And agriculture continues. Things like this soybean field, I want you to look at that because I don't have another picture for it, but I'm going to talk about it when I talk about mammals. Corn, soybeans, the row crops still on the dairy forage land especially don't provide much habitat, just basically for a few horned larks and a vesper sparrow occasionally, although they can provide some food for and waste grain in the winter and fall. Grass hay is another story. This is the kind of hay that used to be around in the between the 1830s and the 1940s. And we find so many grassland birds in here. It's not cut. The Ho-Chunk doesn't let it be cut until mid-August generally. But there are so many grassland birds nesting. It's full of bobolink nests and especially meadowlark nests, grasshopper sparrow nests, and gives us some indication of how abundant these birds may have been prior to the conversion, widespread conversion to alfalfa in the landscape. Of course, the haying keeps the shrub invasion out as well. And the last thing I want to mention for current management and management that'll go on to the future is harvesting of some of these pine plantations that were planted in the mid 1900s as sort of wildlife habitat or just general conservation, hold the soil sort of thing. But basically they ended up being these things that just fragmented the grasslands. As you can see in this picture, this is the moraine road that runs along the moraine. This is the road that comes in from the entrance through the Ho-Chunk land. And this one was just cut. It looked like this 2 years ago. Red pine, full of an understory of buckthorn and honeysuckle, multiflora rose. And this year it was clear cut, looks like this. And now the DNR, it's on DNR land. And so the plan is to, at some point, they'll burn this and they'll plant it to prairie, and we'll have a more continuous tract of grassland here, which is really beneficial to a lot of the grassland birds. And loggerhead shrike, this is a songbird, but it's predatory. As you can see, it catches mice, large insects, impales them on thorns, like here, naturally on a plum thorn or something. They also do it on barbed wire, and we have had a pair here last year and this year. They haven't nested successfully yet, but they're trying, and we hope that they or their whoever succeeds them can do that here. But the breeding bird atlas in the current breeding bird atlas, which ended 3 years ago, where people were out looking for shrikes and looking for everywhere they could find them, there was only one location in the state. Shrikes were here until the 70s. There was a good spot for them on the S curve west of Schlickerbeer Prairie, that where it's now center pivot agriculture, was a sandy pasture with some plums and cedars along the hedge, and it was perfect for them. And that was a very typical habitat for this bird, but it's so hard to find it anymore. It also is interesting because the shrike has a very large territory, and it kind of needs a patchy habitat. And when we watch these birds here nesting, they would nest in like a hedgerow or a shrub thicket, like this, and they would forage out in the grassland, especially where the ground was almost bare, in little spots like that, where they would sit up on a dead twig, fly down to the ground and get an insect or a small mammal. So that's it for birds. I want to move on to small mammals. What time is it?
It's 7:47.
No. Okay. So methods for small mammals. We're also interested in the same sort of thing with small mammals, and that is looking for these species of greatest conservation need and trying to see what kind of habitat they need. And again, it has a historical component because these things, we know trends, in them as well. We catch them in these little box traps. We mark them, like here, a blue on the tail. We measure them, identify them, throw them back out there, and hopefully recapture them and get an estimate of their population. And these were the locations of our transects, mostly on the Ho-Chunk land, where we're trying to monitor the sequence of habitats from old field to 3 years of corn and soybeans, where the weeds are removed, and then planting to prairie. So this is what an old field looks like in Badger, what a lot of them look like, where nothing's been managed except occasional fire since deconstruction. Corn in the process. This is the prairie planting in the 3rd year. And down here is a older prairie planting in the eastern part of Badger. It's 20 years old. Species that we're looking for. Prairie vole, they look very similar. The meadow vole, very common. Prairie vole is rare, and it's just pretty rapidly declining and becoming almost impossible to find. Whereas that H.C. Hansen in the 40s, looking over it when he was over just across the river, there were hardly any of these, and there were lots of these. So he also considered this to be the most common rodent in the Driftless area. So something's changed, and we're trying to figure out what that is. And not that we necessarily want to get rid of meadow voles, but we don't want to lose this prairie vole, which is very interesting. It has a real different life history than the meadow vole. It has like central families, family units, and it's very odd. It's so much different. You wouldn't think that to look at the two species. Another pair is the common white-footed mouse that you get in your house and in every woods in Wisconsin, and the prairie deer mouse, which has a shorter tail, a little shorter snout. And here's a prairie deer mouse den. They like open soil. So again, the deer mouse is the one that we would like to find out what it needs. The white-footed mouse is so abundant that we don't think we need to worry about providing habitat for that, but that's what Hansen would have said about Microtus ochragaster, the prairie vole, 60 years ago. Another species, the harvest mouse, is another species we don't know much about, and Hansen found that to be fairly common as well, much more common than it is today. And they'd find a lot of these animals under grain shocks. They'd find them in agricultural fields, as well as in prairie remnants. And these are just some of the other mammals that we found on the, including redback vole, which is a southern record for that. Just to look a little bit at the data, the old field, you know, the problem with small mammal populations is that they change a lot from year to year, and they change a lot from spring to fall. This is an old field that hardly from what we could see, didn't change habitat at all between 2018 and 2021. Moisture changed. 2020 was, I believe, was a much moister year. That may have had something to do with it. But you look at the difference in the mammal species and abundance between these years, and it makes it very difficult to detect changes and differences in habitats and so on. So we need to pursue the project for years at a time. But here's one that I think does show some real changes. When the soybeans that the Ho-Chunk had planted were planted then to prairie, you see the soybeans were thick and they had both species of deer mice in them. The woodland deer mouse, the copus, was in the more up in the soybeans. Beardeye, the prairie deer mouse, was down on the ground. When they planted the prairie, it became very bare. The only species out there was Beardeye, the prairie deer mouse. And 2020, again, a moist year, and starting to build litter. You had quite a diversity of species, and you started to get the shrews, Blorina and Sorex, in here. It was burned the next spring, and the shrews disappeared, and the population went down, I think partly because of the burn, but something we need more cycles to tell what's really happening there. I want to put in a plug for the Zoo Museum, especially because of the history here. This is the curator at the museum. The technicians that are preparators that take species like this, specimens like this redback foal that I'd caught and that died, and turns it into study skins so they can be used in the future for reference as a voucher for what you caught. And the same work happens with plants, although I'm not involved with that here. Herbaria are very important places for historically. In fact, this guy down here is reading a letter. I won't read it to you, but it's a plant specimen that was sent from around Atlanta by a Union soldier. And if any of you were here for the last talk that Heather gave about a Wisconsin boy from just half a mile north of here who died in that campaign. This was another soldier sent this plant and a very eloquent letter about finding that plant in the middle of the Battle of Atlanta. And he sent it to Increase Lapham, who was a famous scientist and back in the day was the botanist for the state. And it ended up being at the herbarium. David Olson is going to be helping us this year look at DNA on the small mammals. There's those two deer mice that I talked about. They're really hard to identify, distinguish, especially when they're young and they're not fully grown. And by looking at the DNA, you can make those determinations. And in fact, many specimens that go into museums, zoological museums now, are just tissue samples, not the whole animal, not the study skin, but tissue samples that can be looked at for DNA. And anyone who's done 23andMe or Ancestry.com knows the importance of DNA to learning about history. And I'm not going to talk about amphibians because I don't have time, but I will say that the eastern gray tree frog and the Cope's gray tree frog are another pair, just like the deer mice and the two voles that likes more open habitat, shrubby sometimes. And the eastern gray tree frog, which looks pretty much identical, which likes more forested habitats. And at Badger, we've seen from our nocturnal surveys that the eastern gray tree frog has increased and the Cope's has decreased with, we assume, because of the shrub and tree encroachment that's happened since '98. And I won't talk about the salamanders. Most of you have heard about that, but it's definitely a very interesting story. The neotenic salamanders on the north edge of Badger. We'll talk about that another time. A lot of people have been involved in that project. Insect surveys. My son Angus has been working a lot on insect surveys this year at Badger, doing nightlight, where you attract insects at night a lot, mostly moths, but not entirely. Also spreading bait, which is a combination of brown sugar and sometimes beer, and what am I missing?
Bananas.
Bananas. And who could resist that, as you can see. And then also running bumblebee surveys, just doing transects through different habitats. And here Angus is actually photographing a bumblebee nest. And then we also get records just from people like Garrett, Garrett from the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance, who was out doing a story on ecology there. And we found some pretty interesting bee behavior going on. Angus's tools of his trade, including the inevitable spreadsheet at the end. And there are so many pollinators. I wasn't aware of this, but it's not just bees, it's not just butterflies, it's wasps, flies, beetles, hundreds of species that pollinate. And to watch a flower and to be kind of start to learn these things is eye-opening. Plenty of sources for this, for information to understand the trends, etc. There's 12 species of badger. 7 of them are SGCNs. They need habitat for wintering, dens to winter in for the queens. They need foraging habitat for the growing season, and they need a nesting habitat as well to rear their broods. So it's not just one thing that they need. They also need diversity phenologically, stuff to feed on in the spring, early spring, in the summer, and in the fall. So again, it's complicated. If you look at the rusty patch bumblebee, which is sort of the famous one these days, you just look at this historic range, the current range, and how much it's contracted. And this is one that actually is found in lots of places around here. We were always excited for the first few records, but it's being found in lots of places, which is good. But you see, that doesn't mean that the species is in good shape. And we look at the habitats that it frequents at badger, grass hay, but a lot in the planted prairie. So this is a good sign for the prairie planting and its diversity. And open means those kind of open old fields. But again, the different habitats are more important in different times of the year. These are those species of SGCNs, the bumblebees, that they use grass hay kind of all year, all summer and fall. Planted prairie was hardly used at all in the fall. And those animals, we assume, were going over to the grass hay or into some of these other habitats. And the number of individuals by habitat, these are all the SGCNs down here. And you can see the green being grass hay again. What an important habitat that is, partly because of all the clovers in it. Not native whatsoever. And the native prairie is the blue, but the prairie is not well developed yet as well. It's only 3 years old. So these are sorts of things to monitor to see how they change with time. And often we can kind of, again, we kind of can predict backwards when we know how much grass hay there used to be on the landscape, kind of get some feeling for how, the abundance of wildlife that might be there. Last thing is Angus was looking out at the prairie along Highway 12 in the Fordham Prairie, where there was a lot of prairie dock, these tall sunflowers planted, found the state endangered Silphium borer, which feeds as a caterpillar on a lot of the large sunflowers, rosinweed, compass plant, cup plant, I suppose, and at least on the Silphium, on the prairie dock. There's one more thing. There is this is really the only real citizen science project that I'm aware of at Badger with the Monarch joint venture. There's no results from this year, but they did start doing Monarch surveys. Their study sites are shown here, mostly on Ho-Chunk, and they're basically looking at patches of milkweeds, which are mostly common milkweeds here. So hopefully we'll see what happens there. Monarchs, of course, have tanked over the last several decades. Seem to be doing pretty well at Badger in a lot of places these days. So just with ending, whether we regardless of how we study history or how we go out on the land and how we see it or how we sense that flow of time or what it makes us do. I think it's good that we have a variety of ways of doing that and that we continue to do that and share it with each other. So anybody's still there?
I'm afraid to turn my.
I'm
Do I get an echo? I do. Okay, hopefully you
wanna-
can hear me through Mike's mic. If there are any questions, well, first of all, thank you so much for that talk, Mike. That was wonderful and very informative, and I'm sorry I botched your title at the start. If we can open up for questions now, if you want to type them in the chat, or I think we're a small enough group, both online and here in the museum, you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand if you want to ask the question, and I'll do my best to moderate it. Any questions? Yes, Frank.
I'll start then.
Great.
Have you found any species that aren't supposed to be here?
well,
Maybe repeat the question for the.
Yeah. Have we found any species that aren't supposed to be here? Well, the neotenic salamander was one, even though that's a common species. It's the eastern tiger salamander, but those weird population up in the reservoir is unheard of. But I think Angus probably is with insects, which is less known about and which are harder to survey. I think he's found some new records for not just for badger, but for the county for sure, and some that are haven't been seen in the state for a long time. So he could answer that.
What do you mean by not supposed to be here? I guess.
Well, something that would be out on the wide open prairies like in Nebraska or someplace like that, and all of a sudden you find it here in Wisconsin and the soft prairie. Something like that is what I was thinking of. And I can see where it's probably going to be some kind of an insect or something that it could move around.
I think
I would say that moth there is a good example. That's, the Corbett's range is in tall grass prairie to the south here, and we're at the very northwestern edge of its range, and it wasn't really known from Sauk County, so maybe that would be a example of that. There's another one, the American bumblebee, declining species of bumblebee that was last seen in Sauk County in 1964. I was here at Badger last year. Could be around, but it was documented here in 1964 and not since until last year. So another one that, historically was supposed to be here, but in terms of now, you might not think it's found here anymore.
I think most of those probably are things that make sense that they're here because the habitat seems to be here, but you wouldn't expect it to be here because it's so rare. But not like something way out of its range. And usually stuff that is way out of its range is usually a fluke. I mean, there have been some plants that have been reestablished in Wisconsin along railroad grades and so on that came from, probably the Great Plains that fell off of railroad cars or out of wheels or something that way. Of course, birds show up that are weird all the time, but it's great for your list, but it usually doesn't mean very much for, conservation. They're just blown off course or some wandering bird that lost its way or something. Yes.
So we have two questions from chat. Rory Pulaski has asked, has there been any discussion of restoring savanna habitats at Badger? And Emily Brunhoff has asked, will you be doing any talks about the herps in the near future?
Yes, I'll talk about the herps and put them at the beginning. And I don't have any planned on that, but it would be fun to do. We've done nocturnal surveys on and off since '98, and for frog songs like basically your Wisconsin frog and toad survey method. And we have quite a bit of work done on the neotenic salamanders. And also Rory has Pulaski is also doing some cover boards work out there this year, so maybe we could join on something. And Rory, yeah, so savanna restoration is something the DNR would like to do, and I can't speak for them, but that is their goal for most of the moraine on their property, and which is where the savanna was originally. It's just such a long process. Right now, they're kind of reestablishing some cottonwood savanna. You might call it a surrogate savanna, where the cottonwoods have come in all since 1942, but they're huge. And they sort of provide that savanna aspect in many places. The main problem right now is getting rid of the shrub encroachment and then getting fire into these places. And at some point, probably planting some oaks, because there's very few oaks that remain out there, native oaks. But there are some, and there's plenty of trees, oaks out there that we could collect seed from and get a project where we could get local school kids or whatever to collect seed and start growing some of these seeds and plant them out.
That ties into a question that just came in. Lisa, we'll get you in a
That's all
sec.
right.
But that ties into the question, are there any planting efforts to aid the restoration?
Yeah, well, so far, the Ho-Chunk has been doing a lot. They've planted one big swath, two swaths of prairie on their property. They're working on another one, which is in corn now, which will get planted hopefully in 2 years in the fall. And then there's the prairie restoration that's going on right along the Great Sauk Trail. So if anyone rides that trail, watch it happen. They just prepared the soil and are starting to plant and started the planting this last year. And Jeb Barzin, I think, is still, if he's still in here, worked on developing that whole plan. So that should be exciting, because that'll be very accessible. And that actually will run as a continuous corridor, which has its advantages. And hopefully for bikers and hikers on that trail, they'll be able to see prairie for, a 2 or 3 mile stretch.
Lisa?
Could you talk about any species that badgers important to for the wintering time?
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. Are there any species that badger, the former badger plant is important in the wintering time? Because I talked entirely about kind of breeding season for birds. Yeah, raptors are quite abundant here in the fall, winter, and spring on migration and off their breeding grounds. So short-eared owls are one of those, harriers, red tails, rough-legged hawks. So species that are feeding on that rodent population, which brings up the other point that these rodents are interesting, not just from a biodiversity standpoint on their own, but also in that they're really an important part of the ecosystem. They're prey for a lot of larger mammals and birds, and they also eat many of Angus's insects. And but on the other hand, they also have burrows, which most bumblebees will use for nesting, and snakes we use as well. They plant seeds by putting them underground and then dying and leaving them behind. And, it's an important part of the system, those small mammals. And then also in the winter, the small mammals are still here, and we don't trap them. So I'm curious where they all are and how they're living then. It would be a interesting project to do, but that's when I have to analyze all my mammal data, so I can't do that. And yeah, can't think of anything else offhand.
We're at 10 after. If there's no other questions, we can probably take one more question.
I want to encourage everyone to
I see
get
one
out there.
person raising their hand. Why don't you unmute yourself? Ibby?
Hi, I can hear you. Yes, I'm Dr. David Olson's student. And one of the things we're learning about in biology is that living organisms adapt to environments, and that environments are changing. And so that has an effect on them, and they in turn change a lot. So my question is, knowing that change is inevitable for living organisms, why is it so crucial for us to conserve the ones that exist if they will eventually adapt and change also?
Well, good question. And it's something I think we all ask ourselves. But this, the rate at which things are changing is so much faster than, for most species and their habitats, so much faster than species can adapt to, especially for longer lived species or species that don't reproduce, that much every year to sort of provide the fodder for evolution. When you look at climate change, for example, and the rate for prediction of how fast things are moving north for trees, for example, it's hemlock tree, which will grow to 400 years old. And there's almost no place in Wisconsin that we can have a old growth hemlock forest anymore, because by the time any hemlocks in far northern Wisconsin reach that age, it's probably not going to be suitable anymore. So there's a rate that species can travel. There's a rate that species can evolve, and sometimes we hope that the travel and the changing of ranges will adapt. And a lot of species are also, to climate change. Also, some species are very malleable. They don't have very strict requirements for their life history. They're adaptable without really evolving, but that can drive the evolution. But again, some species are not. Some species are very specific, at least from our point of view. So it's important to do what we can. One of the important things for us to do is to stop the world from changing so much if we can. Do our little part of that. But you're right. Species have come and gone through time immemorial. If they hadn't, we wouldn't be here. And but it's the speed now that's the problem. And part of our work is to try to help answer some of those questions about how do species adapt? Where do species change in their ranges? And we're always looking for species from the south that may be coming up. For example, that happens with birds quite a bit because they can move so quickly. Carolina wrens and other things, blue grosbeaks that are moving north pretty quickly with climate change. But things like trees and small mammals, amphibians have a much harder time.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
I think with that too, through Mike's presentation, we learned that there's a whole history of observation that's been conducted here at the former Badger Army Ammunition Plant area when it was pre-ordnance works, during the ordnance works, when it was the plant era, post-plant era that we're kind of still experiencing now from the conservation era, and its various property managers. So the observation of nature that's happening so quickly around us is as important as ever. So thank you, Mike. Thank you again. And before everyone signs off and Verlin stops recording, I'd like to just announce next month's Badger History meeting lecture. It will be nitrous cellulose production at the Badger Ordnance Works by Frank Wolf, who's a former employee. I'm forgetting your position. Was it supervisor?
I don't remember.
Okay, he doesn't remember either, but you don't want to miss it, that's for sure. It'll be 7 p.m., probably via Zoom and in person. So please join us next month. And thank you again all for coming this evening.